So now we're ready to sell some shares. We know about balance sheets, we know about cap tables, we know about common versus preferred, so let's sell some preferred. So first, mark the moment. 3 founders come together, start a company. It's an idea, it's in their imagination. They bootstrap, they work hard, they're able to cultivate and create something that a third party shows up and says, you know what, not only is this interesting, and not only do I like you, but I want to write a check and invest into your company, in your idea, in your baby. That's a big deal. Now we're gonna learn how to do that. So I'm gonna write a couple of equations on the whiteboard. Let me lay these out, and then we will break them apart piece by piece. Pre-money valuation divided by pre-money equity equals price per share. Let's call that PPS. Okay? Then investment amount divided by price per share equals the number of shares. Okay. We are solving for the number of shares. Why? Well, because without the number of shares, we don't know how our cap table lays out, right? So remember, our cap table is our map. This is precious, this is sacred. It's got to be right, it's got to be accurate, and the ownership percentages must add up to 100%. No more, no less, zero-sum game, 100%. And what we look to is we look to the shareholdings. So if we have a preferred investor, and let's say that this individual is prepared to invest $500,000 into the startup, we need to know how many shares they're buying. Because what that will do is then drive ownership percentages, which will add up to 100%, which tells us how to allocate net proceeds in the event of sale. But we can't do any of that without knowing how many shares they're buying. Are they buying 1 share? Are they buying 1 million shares? How do we know? We know they're investing $500,000, but how do you get from $500,000 to X number of shares? This is how you get there, these equations. So we're solving for number of shares so that we can update our cap table and have an accurate cap table. Well, how do we get there? Investment amount. Well, we know what that is based on our hypothetical. It's $500,000. All right, so we're done. Well, not quite. Because in order to calculate number of shares, even though we know the investment amount, that's our numerator. Our denominator is price per share. We don't know what that is. We can't just assert $1 or 50 cents or a dime. We need to calculate it. It needs to be based on something. It's not arbitrary. Well, we don't know what it is, but we know how to figure it out. And that's what this equation tells us. Once we solve for price per share, then we'll know what our number of shares is. Well, how do we do that? First, let's start with the denominator. Pre-money equity. Well, what the heck does that mean? Pre means before. Money means money. But what kind of money? This money, okay? Before the investment, before this $500,000, what's the total equity? This is a share number, okay? It's what we have in our cap table before we sell anything to this preferred stockholder. And you'll recall the example we've been using throughout, it's 10 million shares. So remember, founder A had 6 million, founder B had 3 million, founder C had 3 million, going back to the very beginning of this episode. 10 million shares. So we'll use that here. Great. 10 million shares before the $500,000 is invested. That leaves one final term. Pre-money, before the investment, what's the company worth? Valuation. What is the company worth before the investment is made? Once you know the pre-money valuation, you can figure, with the use of the pre-money equity number, what the price per share is. Once you know what the price per share is, you divide the investment amount by that price per share. That tells us the number of shares. So when you're selling shares of stock, when you're raising money by selling preferred in a seed deal, or in a venture capital financing for that matter, anytime you're selling shares of stock, you need to do so by means of a valuation. It's essential. You can't get out of it. What is the valuation? It's the value of the company. What's the company worth? What do we look to? Well, going all the way back to the introduction of this episode, you'll recall some of the parameters that we wrapped around this space, this startup space. And we talked about these being product-oriented companies. We talked about them being intellectual property-oriented companies. We talked about them leveraging technology or biotechnology or being in the life sciences. These sorts of companies at the earliest stage don't lend themselves to easy valuation mechanics. Main Street businesses, operating companies, typical companies. Many of you will be familiar with the sorts of multiples that are applied. Valuations are determined based on a multiple of revenue, or a multiple of earnings, or a multiple of EBITDA, or net profit, or lots of discounted cash flow. Lots of different ways to at least get started coming up with a valuation for those sorts of companies. For these sorts of companies, not so much. Multiple of revenue, there is no revenue. Multiple of earnings, there are no earnings. Discounted cash flow, there is no cash flow. So it's not a way to get started. So where does valuation come from? Well, valuation tends to come from the market. Now, before diving into this further, let me share another equation to add a little bit more jargon to the mix. And this is a very basic equation, but it will help set up the next piece of the conversation, which is simply this. Pre-money valuation, right, before plus the investment amount equals post-money valuation. Okay? Why is it expressed this way? And why does it even matter? Well, let me play around with this a little bit more. You could also say the same thing. Post-money valuation minus investment amount equals pre-money valuation, right? I just turned it upside down. If pre-money valuation is a valuation of the company before the money is invested, post-money valuation is the valuation of the company after the money is invested. It's as easy as that. If the pre-money valuation is $4 million and the investment amount is $1 million, the post-money valuation is $5 million. $5 million minus $1 million equals $4 million. Okay, why does this matter? Well, one way that you see, especially in the seed deal context, but don't be surprised if it shows up in a very late stage venture capital investment, but you see it all the time in the seed deals arena, is we back into valuation by using ownership percentages. So what does that mean? Well, in the example that we've been playing around with, the investment amount is $500,000. So if my client is the company, the founders will call me, or if my client is the investor will call me, and they will say, I'm investing $500,000 into this company, and I'm buying 25% of it. And I say, okay, if you're buying 25% of the company for $500,000, I can do that math in my head. Thanks for making it easy. My post-money valuation is $2 million. How do I know that? $500,000 divided by $2 million, 25%. What else does this tell me? Well, I can do the math upwards and backwards and come up with a pre-money valuation of $1.5 million. 1.5 plus 0.5 is 2, or what I really did is I said 2 million minus $500,000 equals 1.5 million. Now I know my pre-money valuation. And with that in hand, I can run the math. Now it may be that the founders and the investors in the context of this negotiation never said $2 million out loud, never said $1.5 million out loud. They simply said 25% of the company for $500,000. But what they did through the back door, in my example, unintentionally, and they stumbled into it, but sometimes it's intentional, is they reached valuation that way, indirectly, glancingly, by starting with the post-money ownership percentage. And this is totally legitimate. It works. It's fine. It's a very credible way. It's a very practical and pragmatic way to calculate valuation. And what I would say is even if the parties don't start this way, and if they're literally starting here with pre-money valuation and trying to come up with ways to describe pre-money valuation, I promise that this is floating around in the background. What ownership percentage do I want to have? Because an investor, unless they're investing an infinitesimally small amount, doesn't just want to buy 0.25% of a company. Same time, the founders don't want to sell 70% of the company. So they've got some targets in mind, some ranges in mind. And what's interesting, one of the things you'll find is that typically the range sorts out at 20 to 30% per round, because it feels like a soft spot in between the two poles. It gives the investor enough to be excited about, but it's not so much that the founders feel put out by it. They feel like there's not enough upside left for them. The key thing for the founders, of course, is to make sure that when you're selling that 20 to 30% of the company, you're getting enough money for it. But that's another topic. So we've talked about ways to sneak up on valuation, either indirectly by virtue of working with percentages, or directly by just going right to the valuation conversation. But the point is, we have to have the valuation. And once you've done that, now you can calculate number of shares.